his most famous sermon recorded in the Bible, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says a remarkable statement. He says that those who are his followers are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. He says that those who follow him, who make him Lord, who apprentice their lives to following and being like Jesus, are actually a preserving agent in the entire world. And that because that's what salt was. The salt of the earth meant that your being followers of Jesus keeps the rot out of the world in some tremendous way. And that you're the light of the world, that just by living like Jesus, you push away the darkness of fear and the darkness of hate and the darkness of ignorance. Your life as a follower of Jesus gives light to the world and, in a sense, preserves the world. It's a breathtaking statement when you think about it. And it's quite an aspiration. I want to be light. I want to be salt to the world. And it's very inspirational until you realize that in order to be salt and light, you have to be different from the world. The whole point about salt, rubbing salt into meat so that it's preserved and doesn't rot, is that the salt is different than the meat. And the whole point of light is that you don't bring a dark candle into a room to illuminate it. You bring a light candle into a room to illuminate it. I don't know, my power went out this morning. Power here went out this morning. We thank God that it came back. But at that point, what you need is light. You don't need more darkness. You need something else. And so that says that you and I, if we consider ourselves followers of Jesus, if we received his grace, if we want to follow him as Jesus people, as Christians, that we are salt and light, but only to the degree that we are different from the rest of the world. And so that can be hard. It can be hard. And in the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives a couple of specific examples about how his followers will be different than the rest of the world. We saw that everybody agrees that murder is wrong. But as followers of Jesus, we believe that murderous language is wrong, and that it is wrong to dehumanize and slander people, and even to say violent things against them, even if we never follow through with murder. Everybody knows that you should love your neighbor. But as followers of Jesus, we not only love our tribe, Jesus calls us to love our enemies and to do good to those who persecute us. And so that's, much harder. Much harder. But it is that difference from the rest of the world that makes us unique. And today, Jesus talks about adultery. We're going to look at Jesus' teachings on adultery. Now, to me, that's a little bit encouraging because sometimes when you think about being different than the world, especially as the values of the world are changing so fast, it feels like everything in the culture is terrible and everything is self-indulgent and awful. And yet, when you think about it, Americans really are pretty intolerant of adultery. In general, Christians or people in America think that adultery is wrong. That if you made a promise to somebody to be exclusive to them, then you should keep that promise. And if you break that promise, that's wrong. And so even people who don't consider themselves in any way religious sense that that's a promise that should be kept. Just imagine if Travis Kelce starts, betraying Taylor Swift. You would see a lot of righteous indignation out there in the world because they're supposed to be an item. Whatever they do as an item is up to them. That's what our culture says. But they should keep their promise. And so, you say, well, now if Jesus talks about adultery, maybe that one will be a little easier for us and we're kind of in step with the culture. Okay, so two things as a warning before we go further. One, remember, even when the Bible seems to agree with your presuppositions, even when you read the Bible and it seems like, well, that sounds right, remember, Jesus is talking to a group of Jewish peasants, Jewish middle-class people in the first century in a corner of the Roman Empire. He's talking to them. He expects what he says to make sense to them. It's been recorded for us but we are listening in on that conversation. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves, oh, the things he's saying make sense to them. What does that look like in my culture? That's part of our responsibility of Jesus followers, is to take the word and say, what is this saying to me? The other thing is that culture changes. Culture changes. And if people still feel this kind of moral superiority about adultery, that could change in our lifetime. And it wouldn't be that surprising, because if there is one area where followers of Jesus feel out of step with the rest of the culture, it's in sexuality. If there's one area where Jesus seems to be out of step with what people want to do, it's sexuality. And if there's one area where we are tempted to disregard what Jesus says, it's in the area of sexuality. So let me show you what I mean. Let's start in Matthew chapter 5. We're in verse 27. And it says this, Matthew 5:27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. They had all heard that. That was one of the 10 commandments. You have heard that it is said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already created adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go to hell. You've heard this says, do not commit adultery. Here's the thing about marriage. Marriage is hard because it's really hard to care about another person. Fundamentally in marriage, you disagree with who's the most important person in this marriage. You come into this marriage thinking, I'm the most important person in this marriage. You don't say that, but that's how you feel. You've always been the most important person to you in your life, and you figure that's just going to continue in marriage. This person makes you feel very important when you're dating, and you think that that will continue. You probably even said stuff like that in love notes to them. You probably said, I love you. You make me feel like the most important person in the world. You make me feel brand new. How sweet it is to be loved by you, right? And then you probably even said, you make my dreams come true. And then after marriage, you're like, this is great. Let's make my dreams come true. And then you get into marriage, and all of a sudden this other person has all their dreams. They have all these things that they want to do. And you start to get the feeling that they don't think you're the most important person in this relationship. And so then you try to compromise, like, well, how much can I give away while making myself the most important person in this relationship? How can I maybe fake it, you know? And you think having kids will help. And then you just realize you're just further down on the totem pole. You know, now the other person thinks of themselves first, and then the kids, and then now you're like third or fourth, depending on how many children you have. And so marriage is really hard that way. And when you think about it, adultery is the most self-centered, selfish thing that you can do. Adultery is really the act of saying, I'm not getting my needs met. I'm now going to do something I should only be doing with you without telling you. I'm going to betray you behind your back because I need it. It's the ultimate act of making yourself the center of marriage. And so that's why it's so damaging. But it's really just an extension of what we all feel. It's an extension of this sense that I need to get my needs met. And I'd like to keep your needs important. We agree that they're important. They're just not more important than me. And so that's why adultery is so damaging. Now, most people, I think, in marriage, at least in the American culture, don't commit adultery because it's just too much work. You know, there's so much work to adultery. In fact, and like I said, the idea of this being acceptable could be changing. This week, the Wall Street Journal had an article about polyamory. Polyamory is, they're not talking about polyamory as a sexual orientation, like being attracted to both sexes. That's not what they're talking about. They're really talking about a formalizing of an open marriage. So in this, they're talking about people who have more than one partner with the full knowledge of their spouse. They call it consensual non-monogamy. And so this is people who say, we have this other person in our marriage, or at least I do, and you know about it, And they said in the article, the most difficult thing about it is the scheduling. And it's just so much. Now you got twice the drama because you got multiple sexual partners. You got twice the in-laws. You got sexual partners. I mean, Thanksgiving must be a nightmare. And so that's why most people tend not to commit adultery, because it's a lot of work. But the culture could change, and it could become easier. And I could go into a whole diversion on this, and I don't, because I don't want to go long, and there's so much to say. But really, when you think about it in our culture, there is no reason why we don't legalize polygamy. Right now, if somebody wanted to legalize polygamy, our politicians have no answers to that. We've already redefined marriage. And so the only reason why that's not going to happen is because the insurance companies don't want to insure multiple spouses. I'm convinced that's the only thing. They'd be like, look, you can have as many spouses, you pick one, Because then they'd know, everybody'd be like, look, I don't really like you, but can you marry me? I need health insurance really bad, And that's what would happen, and they see the corruption, so maybe that's not going anywhere. But there's no philosophical reason. When Jesus is talking about adultery, he's not just talking about a scheduling problem. He's digging much deeper. And that's why he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. For most of my life, when I read this, I thought to myself, Jesus takes a perfectly good, sound command, thou shalt not commit adultery, and just makes it impossible. That if you look at a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery. So just all of us crash and burn. And so he's obviously creating an ethic that nobody can ever follow. And so I didn't understand, why is he doing this? Does that mean you can't look at people? You can't be attracted to people? As I've lived longer and watched more, I've come to realize that Jesus is actually, not spoiler alert, much wiser than me. And that there really is something that he is commanding us out of his love for us. Jesus is not saying here that you can't be attracted to another person. He's not saying that men and women can't work together as equals and can't be in partnership with each other, those kind of things. Lust is an act of the will. Lust is an intentionally using another person for your own benefit. And it is dwelling on them. It is going to that place mentally. It's like the congressional hearing on pornography, where they said, we can't define it, but we know it when we see it. And really, if you're honest, that's how lust is. You know it when you feel it. And you can either choose to go there and indulge in it or not. And so that's what Jesus is talking about. And Jesus says that adultery, one of the problems is it starts in the heart. Nobody betrays their marriage or betrays their partner without first thinking on it and dwelling on it for quite a long time. Because again, it takes so much planning. And so it starts in the heart. It starts in the mind with a continual dwelling on it. So Jesus says, don't go there. And he says, it's really, really serious. And you should take steps to avoid it. Now, when Jesus is saying, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Jesus is not advocating self-mutilation. He's not saying that. And I think most of us, if we reflect on it, would think that wouldn't do me any good anyway. Gouging in my right eye is not going to keep me from lusting if that's part of my habits. What Jesus is saying, he's using hyperbole. He's saying, take steps to eliminate this from your life. Because Jesus knows that lust is ultimately very, very destructive. It's destructive in a couple of ways, but let me just name two. One, when you lust, you treat another person as only one thing, just as a sexual creature. You're looking at them for your own amusement, whether it's pornography or some other thing. You're looking at them for your own amusement, and you're treating them only as a sexual creature. Now, every person above puberty is a sexual person. And in marriage, you get to see a person and experience them as a sexual person, as well as a partner and a friend and a co-parent, or a business partner, or a colleague. You get to experience somebody in all of these ways, and sex is one of them. And so sex becomes part of a larger relationship. That's God's desire. But in lust, you only see that person as one thing. And so in that way, you're dehumanizing them. And I think when that's done with people, that's why there's such a sexual abuse problem in our culture, I think. It's because people have trained themselves to see the other person as a sexual person, and since they're dwelling on that all the time, they can't stop themselves when they have the opportunity to take advantage of somebody else, to grope or to grab or to exert their power to make somebody take advantage of somebody, because that's their thought life. The other problem with it is not only does it dehumanize somebody and help and cause them only to see a person as a sexual creature, but it releases dopamine in your system. One of the amazing things about sex, Debbie has done a lot of research on this, and she and I do these presentations in public schools. We did 2 this week. Where we talk about what's happening to you biochemically in sex. And there are neurochemicals that cause women to bond and trust with their mate. And there are chemicals that cause men to remember what they're looking at, and there's a huge drop of dopamine for men. Life is great. Life is wonderful. I'm wonderful. You're wonderful. So people love dopamine, and our culture is generally addicted to dopamine. Most opiates, that's what they do, is they release dopamine, and it changes your mood. And everybody's so anxious and stressed that when they find something that changes their mood, they get addicted to it. And if it starts as a prescription opiate and becomes an illegal one, you're in big, big trouble. But the same thing happens in sex. And so when you begin to indulge in lust and pornography, you're releasing that. It's like a drug chemical in your body, and you're the only dispenser. And that's why eventually lust really has very little to do with sex, and mostly with about being addicted to a drug. And Jesus knows this. And the really super sad thing is the deeper you are into lust and pornography, the less real life will release that dopamine. And so people actually become incapable of actual human, physical sexuality because they're addicted to images and fantasies. So Jesus knows all of this. And he says, don't do that. Don't do that. In fact, all addictions are scary. So take steps. Confess it to someone. Make somebody accountable. Share this with them. I know it's humiliating. I know it's difficult. I know it's scary. But begin to talk to somebody about it. Honesty, openness, light breaks this chain. And so Jesus says, take it seriously. Do something drastic to stop it. It starts there. And that's how we are different than the rest of the culture. It's because our deep desire is to trust Jesus on this. So it shouldn't be surprising that as Jesus talks about adultery, that after this, in the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about divorce. So he moves in verse 31 to the next thing. He says this, it has been said. Now, he's not quoting one of the 10 Commandments here. He's quoting something from Deuteronomy, another part of the law. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. You say, wait, how come Jesus is only talking to the men? How come he's only using that one pronoun? He's just saying, if anyone divorces his wife, what about the other way around? Well, in Jesus' world, you couldn't divorce your husband. Men could divorce their wives. Wives could not divorce their husbands. In Jewish culture, in Roman culture, just about in any ancient culture, it was very different that way. So that's why it's a one-sided comment. We then hear in on that, and we apply it to ourselves. In our culture, anybody can divorce anybody. Well, divorce was a really big debate in Jesus' day among the Jews. So if Jesus is talking to a group of Jews, they debated about when you could get divorced a lot. There were two very famous teachers at the time, and they disagreed. One said you can only divorce for sexual immorality. That word sexual immorality it's a Greek word porneia. It means all kinds of sexual deviance and that kind of stuff. It's not just adultery. It can mean all sorts of stuff. And the other one said, no. Anytime your wife becomes unpleasing to you, bad cook, you can divorce her. And so they debated it. And that's one of the reasons why they asked Jesus this, like, where do you come down on that? And so it was a really big debate in Jesus' day. It used to be a big debate in America. What are legal grounds for divorce? It used to be a big discussion in the church. I remember when I was a young seminarian, young training in pastors, always talking about what are the biblical grounds for divorce? When can somebody get a divorce? When is it okay to get a divorce? And anecdotally, my personal experience as a pastor, no one has those conversations anymore. No one ever asks me, what are the biblical grounds for divorce? People just get divorced. People, they don't ask my permission. They don't seem to care what God thinks. People just get divorced. And everybody gets divorced all over the place. Pastors get divorced. Christian leaders get divorced. Non-Christians get divorced. People just get divorced. And they stopped asking about it. Part of that is because in our culture now, we have no-fault divorce. So the culture's like, look, I'm done sorting through your mess, okay? You guys want to get divorced? Okay. Let me talk to your lawyers. We'll sort this out, right? That's all. And so in our culture, you might have very, very strong feelings about divorce, that it's wrong and it should never be done. But if your spouse decides they want to get divorced, guess what? You're divorced. You don't have any say. You're just going to get divorced. The other person has divorced you, and you can't be married to somebody who doesn't want to be married to you, right? Put that on top of the fact that Jesus does say, except for marital unfaithfulness, which in Jesus' culture, he knew everybody would say, oh, well, if you break the marriage covenant, then you're free to remarry, right? And in our day, there are lots of things that break that marriage covenant almost irreparably. Now, to be honest, it's harder to be married now than it was 75 or 100 years ago. It is harder to be married. Back then, in other eras of our world, for a long time, your marriage would just be arranged by your parents. So, like, congratulations, this is your spouse, And in the Middle Ages, they would do that. And that's why there was a lot of unfaithfulness back then, But in our day, you would marry somebody like that you knew from your village. There was only a handful of people that were around, right? People who were also raised by you. And then you'd get married, and everything in the culture worked to keep you together. You couldn't live alone. Men didn't know how to churn butter. Women didn't know how to kill food for dinner, like if you go back far enough. It was just, there were women's roles, men's roles, they worked separately, and you didn't need your spouse to be your best friend. You weren't expecting them to make you come alive and become this new person, right? You were just going to be exactly what your parents were, And so everything in the culture kept you together. And if you watch older movies, or if you watch movies with the grandparents and that kind of stuff, you see that. Everything kept them together. Now, everything pulls you apart. Everything pulls you apart. You're going to live much longer. Spoiler alert. You're going to live a really long time. And you're supposed to be married to this person. And all of us are supposed to be completely reinventing ourselves every couple of years. So you got to stay married to this person. They've got to be the most captivating person to you in the entire world, even though you're going to keep changing and being another person. That takes a lot of work. That's why it's so hard. And then if you allow for the fact that through all of that change, I'm going to continue to make myself the most important person. Well, that's why there's so much divorce. It's really hard to be married. So it's not your illusion. When Jesus is posed with this question in another setting, Matthew chapter 19, Jesus answered this question in a couple of different places. But in Matthew 19, they come to him and say, Can we get divorced for any and every reason, or is there certain criteria? Jesus goes back not to why to get divorced, but he goes to why marriage is important. And so in Matthew 19, he says in verse 4, haven't you read, he said, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? And he said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. They are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. This, from the very first chapters of the Bible, second chapter of the Bible, is really our marching order regarding sexuality, gender, creation, marriage. This is what we go back to, not cultural conventions. He made them male and female. This is why a man leaves his father and mother, and they are united. They become one flesh. Don't you realize that the physical act of lovemaking is only a physical outworking of what's supposed to be happening at a deeper level? Two people become one. They make one household. They become one person. And so nobody should separate them. So basically Jesus says, nobody should divorce. It's never the right thing to do. And that's why he says, if anyone divorces, you make that person an adulterer. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think what Jesus is saying is, it's not that when you divorce somebody and they get remarried, they're in an adulterous relationship. You know? I think what he's saying is divorce is always the result of sin. And the divorce itself is adultery because it breaks the marriage bond. It breaks the marriage bond. Now, divorce is not an unforgivable sin. You don't live in sin and shame for the rest of your life. The divorce itself causes you to become an adulterer because you're no longer bound to the person that you were supposed to be bound to. And you have to grieve that and move through that and receive forgiveness for that before you can move on. It was assumed that if you were divorced, you would get remarried. People couldn't live alone. And so there's a sense of failure and a sense of sin. Now let's remember, when we read the Sermon on the Mount, loving your enemies and reconciling with people, all of us end up sinning in the Sermon on the Mount. So some people, it's just when your sin is divorce in your past, it's much more public. People see it. It carries a lot of weight with it. But the truth is, none of us are living the Sermon on the Mount perfectly. What Jesus says is it's always wrong. It's never the desire. Sometimes divorce is necessary, but it's never good. And if you've talked to a divorced person, it's never fun. It's never easy. Only in the movies do people part and go their ways and live happily ever after. It's an awful thing to live through. Sometimes it's necessary because there are lots of ways to break the marriage covenant irreparably, but it's never what God wants. So what are we supposed to think of marriage? We think of adultery starting in our mind. We think of not treating people only as sexual beings. We think of not living self-centered lives. I often say this when I do marriage ceremonies. Loving an imperfect person for life is about the most godlike thing you can do. To make a commitment to love unconditionally an imperfect person is the most godlike thing you can do. Why would you get married? You get into this situation where you're married and you realize this person's not going to meet all of my needs. They did not read my prenuptial agreement, which was to keep me the center of attention. They're going to go on living their lives. I got to decide what I can do. And you get to that point and say, well, am I going to love this person unconditionally even though they have their own lives? Am I going to help their needs to be met? What am I going to do? And as Christians, you realize, wait, Jesus loved me unconditionally and gave his life for me before I ever did anything for him. He loved me and he forgave me and he made me his child. And that's what he's calling me to do, is in some small way for this one person. He did it for the whole world, but for this one person to say, I will try to love you unconditionally through all of your changes for the rest of my life. And it means I have to make you more important than me sometimes. I'm going to do it because that's what God has done for me. That's what God has done for me. That's why we do it. And it's a miracle. When you make it work, it's a miracle. And God will start to help you to love this person and to allow them to be as important to you as you are to yourself. It will happen. He can't allow that person to become more as important to you as you are yourself. And that's because the most important person in your life now is not you, and it's not your spouse. It's Jesus. Jesus calls you to love your spouse. That's what he does. But Jesus is the most important person. So I'm going to try to love Jesus by loving my spouse. And they're going to be imperfect, and they're not going to make all my dreams come true, and it's going to be hard, and I'm going to fail, and I'm going to get angry, and I'm going to be petty, and I'm going to have to start over again, over and over and over again, but God always forgives me, so I'll try to forgive this person. This one lifetime assignment is one small way that I get to try to be like my Lord. It won't prevent, you can do that. It won't prevent, it can't guarantee that you won't ever get divorced. Because by and large, divorce is generally not up to you. It's up to the both of you. And if one of you quits, in our culture, there's not much you can do. But it will lessen that, and at least you'll understand why God is calling you to such a difficult thing. And you'll understand why marriage is so hard. Because God's trying to pry your hands off of your heart and put them onto somebody else's. So as we conclude, what I want to do is say, don't lust, don't treat people like, stay married, But what I'd really like to ask is, we're followers of Jesus, those of us. We've received that great grace. Why don't we believe Jesus? Why, when it comes to sexuality, why don't we believe him? Almost none of us do. We don't really take the steps to live the way he calls us to live regarding other people. I think it's because illicit sexuality gives such a jolt to our chemicals and makes our lives so exciting that it's keeping us alive. Like any addiction, it's keeping us alive. And I think if we can admit, I'm using this illicit thing to keep myself alive, you're supposed to be the one keeping me alive. You're the one who's supposed to make my life worth living. You're the one who's supposed to fill my soul. You're the one who is supposed to give me purity and grace and goodness and love and joy. Then we can begin to put aside all of our addictions, finding life in Christ. Well, let's pray that through. Father, nowhere will we be more different and out of step with our culture than our sexuality. Father, we confess before you that what you call us to often feels incredibly narrow and very difficult. It's hard to be pure. The culture does not support it. It's hard to focus on one person. Our culture does not support it. It's hard to make you the most important thing in our lives. So, Father, as we close in worship, would you renew us again of your great love for us? And as we feel your love for us, may that fuel our love for others. In Jesus' name, amen.
Let's stand and respond together.